Turn in your Bibles, please, to Matthew chapter 7. We are in this series on Jesus' most famous sermon, his Sermon on the Mount. And this morning, we are going to look at one of the most well-known and possibly the most misapplied sentence in the Bible, and that is, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." Matthew 7, verse 1. Now, I'm guessing that all of us have been judged, perhaps even wrongly judged, at least once in life. Sucks, doesn't it? Feels horrible to be judged. And it is no wonder that one of the main reasons non-Christians say that drive them away from the Christian faith is that Christians are so judgmental. Who gives you the right to judge me? You are no saint yourself. You are a sinner too. You have no right to tell me how to live. You do what you want with your life. I do what I want with my life. Doesn't matter what I do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. Now, today in our postmodern secular culture, that's what a lot of people think we should be doing. The politically correct thing to do is to be tolerant, inclusive, and not to say anyone is wrong. That would be judging. Is that what Jesus meant? Don't ever say to anybody you are wrong. Don't criticize or say anything about their beliefs or behavior, which, by the way, actually what our culture says about judging, it doesn't work. Because when you say you should never tell people they are wrong, you are doing the very thing you say that they should not be doing. So what does Jesus mean when he says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged"? A part of the problem here lies with what we mean by judging. In both Greek and English, the word has a range of meanings. Sometimes it means a simple evaluation. Sometimes it means censuring or condemnation. So what did Jesus mean by judge here in Matthew 7? To begin with, we want to consider what Jesus is not saying. And I think it's safe to say that Jesus is not saying that we can never, under any circumstances, tell a person their beliefs or behaviors are wrong or immoral. Are we to say nothing about the rights and wrongs of Hitler or Pol Pot, or of adultery, exploitation, slavery, and deceit? It cannot be that Jesus calls us to not make any moral judgment about anything or anyone, because in the same breath, he calls some people dogs and pigs. Those are not flattering terms. And others he calls false prophets. In 1 Corinthians 5, it tells us that the church in Corinth was rebuked for not judging one among them who was living in rebellion against the will of God. 1 John 4 says, "Do not believe everyone, but test them to see if they are from God." Now, to do that, you have to make a judgment. Matthew 18 says that a brother who is rebelling, who won't address issues that are clearly outside of God's will, that you are to go to him. Now, you can't do that until you first make a judgment. So, it does not mean that we are not to judge, as in discerning between good from evil. In fact, failure to do so is not only irresponsible, it is also uncaring. If you care about your children, you are going to judge. If you care about yourself, you are going to judge. So, what did Jesus mean by not judging? The clue is found in the context of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. As we look at what Jesus has been teaching in his mountainside sermon, the theme of his teaching is about righteousness. He was addressing the kind of righteousness that ought to characterize kingdom believers. Kingdom disciples, Jesus said, are concerned about inner righteousness and not just outer righteousness, about what goes on in our hearts and not just our behavior. For example, in Matthew 5:21, Jesus said that if we are really concerned about being righteous, we do not draw the line at murder, we draw it at anger. We acknowledge anger as his internal counterpart to murder. And as kingdom disciples, we deal with it. In Matthew 5:38, Jesus talked about revenge. We are not to try to get back at people. Instead, we are to deal in generosity, we are to go beyond our rights, we are to respond with grace. In chapter 6, in his commentary on prayer, Jesus says that if we forgive others when they sin against us, our Heavenly Father will also forgive us. But if we do not forgive others their sins, our Father will not forgive ours. Now, the point of all this is that We are to have inner righteousness. Jesus calls us to a righteousness of motives. And so when Jesus says here, do not judge or you too will be judged, what is he getting at? He's getting at our hearts, our motives. He's saying we are not to be judgmental. We are not to have a spirit of condemnation towards other people, a spirit that puts other people down. Now that kind of judgment comes out of self-righteousness. In Romans 14:10, it says this, you then, why do you judge? The same word, why do you judge your brother? And then he immediately says, why do you look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. Similar idea. Then in verse 13, he goes on to say, therefore let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way. Now the truth is, we make judgments all the time about things, about people. The difference lies in our hearts. What's our attitude? Is it an attitude that shows concern for the person and a desire to restore? Or is it an attitude that wants to punish, to put down, to condemn? Jesus says we must never treat people like that, and he tells us why. Verses 1 and 2, Matthew 7, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it will be measured to you. In other words, if we judge with an attitude of putting people down, God will put us down. If we judge with an attitude of helping other people, God will help us. What measure we use will be measured to us. Well, I don't want to be measured according to the way I sometimes judge other people. This truth alone should change the way in which we tend to view other people's failing. Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria is quoted as saying, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. I believe this is true. And that is another reason why we should not be too quick to judge and condemn. We don't really know what goes on in another person's life. We don't know their entire story. And certainly we can't know their motivation. It's possible for a person to do a good thing with a bad motive. And it's also possible to do something bad with a sincere motivation, right? Now this is what I notice in many people as well as in my own life. Most people struggle deeply and change slowly. Now you probably recognize this man. His name is Patrick Stewart, an actor best known for his work on Star Trek and the X-Men movies. Now what's not known about him is that he grew up in a home of an abusive, violent, alcoholic dad. So when Patrick graduated from school, he left home, stayed away from his father. He was estranged from him for the next 4 years. Every time he thought about his father, the memories were angry and bitter, and it just created resentment in his heart. And so he didn't want to be around his father. And as his father grew older and started dealing with sickness and getting closer to death, someone in Patrick's hometown told Patrick, I do not know if you know this, but your father has wrestled with PTSD over the years, what soldiers refer to as shell shock. Now Patrick didn't even know that his father had fought in a war. His dad never brought it up. He fought 4 straight years, 4 tours of duty in World War II, and was in the front line of one of the worst battles in history. Understanding his father helped Patrick love his dad. Now one of the main reasons why we judge people so harshly, why we are so critical of others, is because we want to feel better about ourselves. Maybe we have been hurt by that person or by what that person represents. So we start pointing out the faults of other people. Now whether we do this in front of those we judge or behind their backs, the result is the same. It makes us feel better, right? When we are judging them. Judging implies we are right and they are wrong. Feels good, doesn't it? Hey Jesus, this woman is an adulteress, let's stone her. If this attitude dominates our lives, we are on dangerous grounds. Now, there's nothing wrong with calling sin out, as we have said earlier. There's nothing wrong with that. But could we do it without being condemning and judgmental? According to Jesus, we could. Really? How do we do that? Verses 3 to 5. Jesus tells us how through this rather peculiar and somewhat comical picture. He says this, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, what's often lost on a lot of us is that Jesus actually has an incredible sense of humor. And you see it most in his teaching and in his preaching. On multiple occasions, Jesus uses a form of humor known as hyperbole, using exaggeration to make a point. Picture someone, Jesus says, with a huge log sticking out of his eye, offering to help another to dislodge a tiny speck of sawdust in their eyes. It is a ludicrous scenario, but it is also a brilliant and convicting piece of teaching. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and do not notice the plank in your own eye? First of all, there's a lot of looking going on, right? You are looking. And he says, it's amazing how you can even see that speck. How can you see the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when the plank is hanging out yours? You know how you can see the speck in your brother's eye when the plank is hanging out yours? The reason you can see that speck is because you are looking for it. You are looking for a speck of anything. Anything you can discover, anything you can find. John Stott, a noted Anglican priest theologian, said it best when he said it this way. It is sinful to look for something wrong in someone else's life and delight in finding it. Ouch, that hurts. Let me repeat that again. It is sinful to look for something wrong in someone else's life and delight in finding it. Here's another thing I want you to know. Speck and plank are made up of the same thing. You got a big piece of wood, and he got a little piece of wood. A plank is just a huge bunch of specks that are connected together. Put in a different way, you see fault in other people, guess what? You have a whole bunch of them as well. And if you fail to recognize yours, you are a hypocrite. You are play acting. To be concerned about another person's sin and not our own is to play act your religion. Now, who would do such a thing? Apparently a lot more of us than we care to admit. He did what King David. He committed two grave sins. Murder, adultery. Remember the time when the prophet Nathan told David a viewed but pointed story about a sheep thief and how David flew into a rage? A poor farmer had one little lamb, Nathan said. The only one he had. And it got forcibly taken away by his rich, powerful neighbor next door, even though his neighbor had hundreds of his own sheep. David was infuriated. He exploded into anger. That man who did this shall surely die, he said. David had a keen conscience about stealing sheep. But somehow, he didn't have any conscience about stealing wives, did he? He was trying to remove a speck of sawdust from a man's eye when he had a huge plank in his own. Jesus is not saying that sin in other people's lives is not important. He's simply pointing out the duplicity, the hypocrisy of concerning ourselves with specks in others without paying attention to our own planks. So what shall we do then? Jesus says, first, take the plank out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I came across a quote by a comedian named Henry Youngman, who is notorious for his jokes and one-liners. He said this: "When I read about the evils of drinking, I gave up reading." I have a confession to make. No, I don't have a problem with drinking. I don't have a drinking problem. But I do have a problem. I have a problem with sin. Other people sin. Hey, don't judge me. If you are anything like me, it is so much better to focus on other people's sin than our own, right? But Jesus says, first take the plank out of your own eye. If we are really concerned about sin, and we ought to be, we will first be concerned about our own. To be concerned about another person's sin and not our own is, Jesus says, to be a hypocrite. Now, it's not so much our reputation that Jesus is concerned about here, but he's concerned about the kind of person we are to be in order to be of help to anyone. Dallas Willard captured this quite well in his book, Divine Conspiracy. He said this: "We will never know how to truly help him until we have grown into the kind of person who does not condemn. Getting the ball out is not a matter of correcting something that is wrong in our life so that we will be able to condemn our dear ones better, more effectively, so to speak." Do you hear what he's saying? It's not about let him who is without sin cast the first stone, which, by the way, we will never be, but about becoming the person who does not want to cast any stone because he understands what condemnation is and what it involves. That's why the Bible says in Galatians 6 verse 1, if someone is caught in sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently, but watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. Watch yourself. In other words, do some self-analysis. Where am I in this issue? Before I deal with my brother's speck, have I dealt with my own plank? So you want to see clearly, if you really want to help other people with their specks, you have to see the plank that's sticking out of your own eye. You have to recognize your own poverty of life and your own sinfulness. And once you realize that you are just as proud, just as self-centered and petty, if not more, than the people around you, then you are going to be able to speak the truth in love, to speak the truth with grace, because you know the agony of sin and the relief of God's forgiveness. So, Jesus says, the first thing you got to do is to first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you can see clearly. See clearly to do what? To tell your brother that what he has in his eye? No, that's not what he says. He says to remove the speck from your brother's eye. In other words, don't simply tell me what's wrong if you can help me make it right. Don't simply be a critic without being constructive. Don't just analyze. Help me remove the speck. Now, that's a very important implication for all of us here. And that is, if I'm not in a place, if I'm not in a safe place to help, I should not be in the business of pointing out the faults of others. Our role is not to be a speck inspector. To inspect is easy. Pointing out people's fault is easy. But that's not our job. We are not to come as a judge to inspect and condemn. But we are to come as a brother, as a sister, to restore. And that's not going to be easy. It's going to require a lot of grace, a lot of humility. It's going to involve a lot of time and energy. Jesus is not saying don't judge. He's saying first take the plank out of your own eye. Right. Two more quotes and I'll be done. The first is from F.B. Mayer, a Baptist pastor and evangelist in 19th century England. He said this: be careful when you judge, for there are three things that you do not know when you judge. First of all, you do not know how hard that person has tried not to sin. Second, you do not know the forces that assailed against that person. And third, you also do not know what you would do in similar circumstances. Good advice. Good advice. This is Katrina Freilich, a neurosurgeon, first female admitted into the neurosurgery residency at a very prestigious University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. She wrote a book years later called Another Day in the Frontal Lobe. It was a bestseller. And in it, she talked about how brain surgery is so stressful and a lot of neurosurgeons become jaded because every day all they see are issues related to neurological conditions and challenges. They become jaded. And in one of the chapters in her book, she talks about a time she was in residency and in a specific situation that kind of woke her up of that jadedness, help her to see people in a different light. She writes this: I walked into yet another examining room. A brand new consult from out of town. 18-year-old, cerebral palsy, spasticity. Okay, I've seen this before. I just need to get a good history before my attending walks in. Efficiency is key. I look at the patient for a second. Very skinny, special wheelchair, arms out contracted, head supported in place, mouth hanging open. It was clear I wasn't going to get the story from him, so I turned to the parents, my back towards the patient, and started to take down the history. When my mentor, the attending physician, walked in, he sat down on the examining table, the only seat left in the cramped room. After introducing himself, he surveyed the compact scene, the patient, the parents, and then focused his gaze back on the patient. After what seemed like several almost uncomfortably quiet seconds, he looked the patient in the eye and asked, "So, when did you graduate from high school?" The young man's face lit up like I had no idea it could. My mentor had noticed something I had missed. The patient was wearing a large high school ring, so large that it looked a little silly on his bony finger. His body, far more than his mind, had borne the brunt of his cerebral palsy. He was a proud, beaming high school graduate who used a specialized computer to help him communicate. For the remainder of the visit, I sat in the corner, dance-like, humbled by the enormity of this ring now staring in the face. Then she reached this incredible conclusion. She said, "We make snap judgments every day. Many are innocuous, dealing with the routines of life. But God is always speaking, especially in our everyday routines. When we prejudge another person and assume we know their story, choosing not to listen to their verbal and non-verbal communication, we make the saddest mistake of all. It is so easy to view people as a statistic and not as a person for whom Christ died. Oh, may that not be said of you and me." Jesus is not saying don't judge. He's saying first take the plank out of your own eye.